Good morning. How are you doing this morning? Doing well? Oh, lovely. I just love coming to visit. I'm from the United States, as you can tell by my unkempt appearance, my long, shaggy hair. This is how everyone from Colorado looks. It's a pleasure to be here. You can't get a good maíz masala dosa in Colorado, so I have to come here and enjoy this. Today, we're going to talk about the Ship of Theseus. Does anyone know the story of the Ship of Theseus? Good, pay attention. You'll learn something today, I promise you that. It's really incredible to think that this conference has been going on for over 10 years. This photo was taken around that time, and as I look in the mirror this morning, there's significantly more white hair in my beard than there was 10 years ago. Time passes, doesn't it? Those of you who have kids know what happens when they're very young and they say, "Daddy, how old are you?" And you tell them, 25, 35 years old, something like that, and what's their reaction? "Wow, you're old." And you try to move on, they're like, "No, really, Dad, you're old." I say, I get it, right? I get it. So after a while, you have fun with it. And when they say, "Daddy, when were you born?" I tell them, "I've been around since the beginning of time." Relatively speaking, for them, that's not a lie, right? But my son is 16 now and is beginning to dabble a bit in programming. So I'm able to prove to him that quite literally I've been around since the beginning of time. Are you able to read this? Yes. If you ask what was date at point 0, at the beginning of time, it comes back and it tells you, this is January 1st, 1970, right? And then I show them my birth announcement, which might be hard to read. Let me see if I can zoom in on the important parts. Are you able to tell that this is on an IBM punch card? Oh, I'm not going to be able to zoom in on this. Unfortunately, it says 1 + 1 = 3. Computer is outwitted. It says Barbie plus Ted equals Scott Howard Davis. And it's dated March 25th, 1970. I have truly been around since the beginning of time, my friends, since the beginning of time. What this also means is if you know someone who was born before January 1st, 1970, you can tell them that they're prehistoric. You can tell them they're prehistoric. So, this little trick, of course, was thanks to Unix time. This is a way that we're able to measure time, and it is fairly arbitrary, isn't it? Obviously, there have been some things that happened before January 1st, 1970, but this is our metaphor. This is what we've agreed upon that is the beginning of time, and that trick works not only in JavaScript, but in Java and Ruby and Clojure. This is our shared abstraction. This is our shared view of the world, that the world began on January 1st, 1970. If you're able to read the fine print up here, you'll also see that we also know when the end of the world will happen as well. That'll happen in the year 2038. It's because that is the year, if you represent the dates in a 32-bit number, that's the year it'll overflow and it'll start going negative. So I was not only around at the beginning of time. With any luck, in 2038, I'll be able to see the end of time as well, as far as 32-bit time measurement is concerned. But really, this arbitrary date, January 1st, 1970, represents an epic, or an epoch, if you're of the British persuasion. It represents a turning point, a point in time, a time that we generally recognize as something new and significant happened. My father sent out my birth announcement on punch cards because that was very modern to him. That was what he was doing on a day-to-day basis. But in 1976, Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs released the first Apple, and they said, "Never trust a computer you can't throw out the window." The first IBM PC came out in 1978 or so. I literally grew up with computers in the house. There hasn't been a time in my memory when I didn't have a computer in the house, and not some mainframe, some abstraction that was somewhere else, but a physical, tangible computer that I could indeed throw out the window if needed. My father taught me how to program and build spreadsheets. My mother is the one that would break down the computer, and we would add new RAM together, and we would add hard drives and things. So this was very, very real to me. Computers were very tangible. They weren't an abstraction. They were something I could touch and interact with. So it's a new era, a new epic, where my father's reality was this: doing work on punch cards that he would then hand to someone else that would walk down the hall, maybe walk to a completely different building. And that wouldn't happen in real time. He'd have to wait for the results of that, maybe tomorrow morning, maybe several days. So in an era like this, the power of abstraction was incredibly important, because you had to have this leap of faith that you knew what was going on. It wasn't a backspace and rerun. It was punch new physical cards and wait at minimum a day to see the results. So we have to have a way to describe our world in terms that we can understand. I want you to notice as well that's a woman's hand holding those punch cards, because in fact the original computers were women. Were women. This abstraction of a machine doing the calculations came from a time when quite literally women, not secretaries, highly valued mathematicians and scientists and engineers would do the calculations meticulously by hand that brought us to the moon, that helped win wars. This was not ancillary work. This was deeply important work. And women were the computers that were making this possible. As a matter of fact, this computer right here is still working at NASA. She is still there. She's able to remember the time. I wonder how she feels about that abstraction when we point at something on a desk and call it a computer, and she says, wait a second, I'm a computer, not that. That's an abstraction. That's an abstraction. There's a lovely book out on this called Hidden Figures that talks about the women of color that helped get us to the moon and the stars. It was a movie that was released several years ago. It's an outstanding movie. But women were instrumental in these. The list goes on and on. This is Margaret Hamilton, who was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Barack Obama several years ago. This is her standing next to her source code. This makes it very real, doesn't it? Source code is an abstraction, isn't it? It's a way for you to think about what the computer is actually going to do, but we look at it on the screen. We talk about algorithms and design patterns. For Margaret, it was very real. This wasn't an abstraction. She was able to touch her source code, stand next to it. I always get worried when I see this picture that it's going to tip over and kill her. And Grace Hopper. Grace Hopper, this is someone that we should all know and all respect. She was one of the first people that wrote a compiler. She was one of the first people that said, you know, we should be able to write a programming language in English words, and have a machine translate our thoughts, our abstractions, into machine language. Up until Grace Hopper, we had to write in the language of the computer. But after Grace Hopper writing the first compiler for COBOL, we were able to express ourselves in our language and translate that to the language of the computer. These are abstractions that we deal with. Every Java developer owes a debt of gratitude to Grace Hopper. Every JavaScript developer, anyone who uses a language that is platform independent, can draw a straight line between what they're doing today and what Grace Hopper did back in the 1940s. You should also recognize Grace Hopper because she was the one that identified the first bug in software. Now, what's interesting about this is a bit of a lie, but we like lies if they're good to tell, right? In fact, she didn't coin the phrase bugs in the software or the corresponding act of debugging them, but she did, in her journal, capture an actual moth that was caught in one of her computers. And she says at the bottom, first actual case of bug being found. Now, some people think that she invented that phrase. Of course, she had a good sense of humor. She was trying to say, look, this abstraction that we've been dealing with for years, I found a physical manifestation of it. She found a literal bug in the machine. So you can see we live in a world of abstractions, of professional abstractions. When we talk about this era we're in right now, January 1st, 1970, this is when the internet was introduced. It was called the ARPANET back then. But in 1969, there was this way to connect computers to each other over vast distances. The first 4 original computers were SRI, the Stanford Research Institute. The first computer on the internet was SRI. This is also the institute that brought us Siri and conversational UIs more recently. But as Stanford was connected to UCLA, was connected to Utah, we were entering a new epoch, a new era, one worthy of being called year 0, because it literally changed everything. And so at Xerox PARC, where we were introduced to the first mouse, the first graphical user interface. This is where Steve Jobs went and was inspired to build the first Apple. A few years prior to that, they were talking about the ether. Now, Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, was also a scientist. Back then, we didn't make distinctions between philosophers and scientists. And he said that vast space that surrounds the planets, that vast space that is in between those celestial bodies up in the sky, that is the ether. So when Robert Metcalfe at Xerox PARC in 1973 said, what networks can we discuss? How can we discuss the vast differences between Stanford and Utah and what connects these computers together? He called it Ethernet. Evocative abstractions. But of course, this is the era we're living in now, isn't it? Oh, you know what an unapologetic Apple fanboy I am. This I love. I love having music playing on the phone in my pocket, with wireless earbuds in my ear, using my watch to adjust the volume to play and pause. What is the technology being used to connect all these devices? Now, it's not ether, although that is evocative. It is the great, unseeable, unknowable element connecting my phone to my watch to my earbuds. But it's not Ethernet. It's not Wi-Fi. In fact, it's Bluetooth. I'll be talking about Bluetooth today. I have several talks on IoT, the littlest cloud, and how IoT talks. But where did Lars and Johan, working in Sweden, come to describe this new technology they created, Bluetooth? Bluetooth was, in fact, a 10th century Scandinavian king who united all the Scandinavian countries together, introduced Christianity to them as well. But he was the great unifying force. That is an epic in Scandinavian history, the first time that these disparate countries were unified. And similarly, this is the technology we use to connect disparate Internet of Things. You can see metaphors are important to what we do. When we come to software conferences like this, we can certainly get excited about new curly braces and semicolons, as I call it. We can get excited about new frameworks. We can get excited about innovations in our industry. But we need to make sure that we keep metaphors close. We need to make sure that we understand what we are doing, because what we are doing is not syntax. What we're doing is semantics. We have to understand what we're doing, and syntax is simply a boring little implementation detail. My first university professor told me, I'm teaching you these programming languages, Scott. You'll probably never use them. I said, well, then why am I spending all this money on a university education? In fact, I had 2 years of COBOL, 2 years of Pascal, never did an hour of professional work in those programming languages at all. However, what my university professor taught me is not a syntax, but a way of thinking, a way of solving problems, a way of describing problems to other people. These metaphors are what he taught me, not curly braces and semicolons. So, there can be good metaphors and there can be bad metaphors as well. We have several bad metaphors in our industry. The assembly line is one of them. Look at that. Look at that. Cars stretching off as far as the eye can see, identical cars being stamped out over and over and over again. Does this feel like a metaphor for what you do? Maybe on a bad day it does, but it shouldn't. I come into organizations and they say, we want to set up an assembly line of software. We want to be shipping this website. And I said, oh, great. How many websites do you want to ship this year? Do you want to ship 1,000 websites? They say, no, that's crazy. Okay, well, you want to ship at least several hundred websites a week, right? I said, no, that's insane. I said, well, no, wait a second. You were the one that said you wanted to create an assembly line in your organization. How many websites do you want to create this year? They said, well, one. Worst assembly line ever, right? When Henry Ford created the assembly line, he didn't create it, he popularized it. He made lots of money on it. He was trying to stamp out identical widgets over and over and over again. He wanted to stamp out identical cars over and over and over again. He said, you can have the car in any color you want as long as it's black. But this idea of stamping out identical cars over and over and over again, in fact, I think is a poor abstract representation of what we do on a daily basis. Lucille Ball was a comedian from the 1950s. This was one of her most famous skits. She was working in a candy factory, and she and her friend were supposed to decorate candy in a very specific way, each candy identical to the previous one and matching the next one identically. And so you can imagine what happens when the candy is moving out slowly. They focus on craftsmanship, on artisanship. They're able to do good work, build out beautiful pieces of candy. And then what happens? The assembly line gets going faster. And they have to do less work, but they're able to keep up. And then the assembly line goes faster. And they're even to do poor work to the point where it gets so fast that they can't possibly keep up. So they're stuffing candy in their mouth and down their shirt as fast as they can. You know what? I've changed my mind. Maybe this is a good metaphor for what we do on a regular basis. Don't you think? If our focus is on developer velocity, this is the logical outcome. If your focus is on developer velocity, then, in fact, what you're going to do is continue to make it faster and faster, and correspondingly, the quality of your work goes down and down until it's not worth doing anymore. This assembly line gets used in a variety of different places. Charlie Chaplin, much closer to the era of Henry Ford and the assembly line, had a famous movie, one of his most famous movies, called Modern Times. He is a factory worker employed on an assembly line. He eventually has a nervous breakdown in this movie. Now, he doesn't seem too upset right now. Does this feel like what you do on a daily basis? Do you get to work and dance? Maybe you should. We all should, right? But look in the background. He has the same piece coming out over and over again. He has to tighten the bolts in the same repetitive fashion over and over and over again until he literally has a nervous breakdown and chaos ensues. But is this really what we do as software developers? Do you end up copying and pasting code over and over and over again? Say no, please. Say no. I have probably written hundreds of login screens. And if you don't understand, if you don't come from a software background, that may feel like identical widgets being stamped out in a mindless way. But in fact, every login screen I've written has been distinct and unique. Every login screen I've written goes to a different database, or uses LDAP, or uses OAuth, or uses any variety of different schemes. So you can look at this and say, yes, they're a bunch of repetitive login screens. We should be able to stamp that out over and over again. But I can't copy and paste code from one project to the next. New languages, new frameworks, new data stores. It is new. And when we think about the cogs in a machine, if you look at a cog in a machine, you find that they aren't identical cogs. They're different sizes and different shapes and have different purposes. So you can say, oh, you're just generating cogs. And in fact, you say, no, I'm creating features that are specific for one particular problem I'm trying to solve. The modern car has over 30,000 parts in it, 30,000 unique parts. Perhaps revisiting this assembly line metaphor is worth our time. I feel this. I feel this every day I come into a new client, that the assembly line is perhaps the most dangerously flawed metaphor in our industry today. I feel that measuring developer velocity is one of the most dangerously flawed metrics that we can measure in what we do. This doesn't represent who we are. This doesn't represent the value our industry provides. We need new, better metaphors. If you read the Agile Manifesto, nowhere do they mention developer velocity. In fact, they say the very first bulleted item, the most important one, we value individuals and interactions over processes and tools. I tweeted recently that Jira and Scrum are the warm beer and cold pizza of Agile. It understandably got a lot of people riled up. Some people came back very offended. They say, oh, what are you talking about? Of course, we are effective with Scrum and Jira. Why would you say something like that? And of course, you can be effective with Scrum and Jira. You can be effective with any tools, any methodologies, if you're mindful about what you're doing, if you really understand what you're doing, if you are really careful practitioners, of course, you can be successful in Scrum and Jira. Are most companies successful with Scrum and Jira? Do most people feel that they are valuing processes and tools over individuals and interactions? I'd argue yes. I would argue yes. So, what this means then is instead of the assembly line, what metaphor can we use to better describe what we do on a daily basis? What metaphor can we use to inspire future generations of software developers? There's another metaphor we can use right out of the auto industry. There's the Henry Ford assembly line, or there's the Toyota model of Kanban. If you look in Jira, Jira supports both Scrum and Kanban. Let me turn around and ask you, how many of you are working with Kanban right now in your organization? Oh, a couple hands go up. Very good. How many of you are dealing with Scrum right now in your organization? Your Honor, I rest my case. See, Kanban came out of Toyota in the 1940s as well, and they recognized the comedy of trying to push developers, push craftsmen to ever do what they do more quickly because quality suffers. I drive Toyotas because they are known for their quality. And in fact, they inverted the assembly line and they said, in fact, what we will do is we'll make sure there is always work available for you when you're ready for it. when they're building out widgets, rather than pushing them down the assembly line at ever faster speed, they have carts that they push around. Those widgets are available to you as you need them, and when you're getting close to needing more work, you hand the Kanban, a physical card. It's almost a baton that says, I'm ready for more work. And so what you've done is you're able to focus on quality, working as fast as you can, but you pull the work when you're ready for more instead of having work pushed upon you. The cadence is regular fixed lengths every 2 weeks, every week. It feels like an assembly line. Kanban, in fact, feels like an assembly line as well, but it's continuous flow. But it's not being pushed, it's being pulled. In Scrum, the release cadence is at the end of every sprint, every 2 weeks. That car is going through the line, and as it gets to the end, you release. Kanban is continuous deployment. There are no big bang moments. You continue to deploy as those features get done. It is a more natural flow. In terms of roles, Scrum has product owners and Scrum masters and development teams. Kanban has no roles, just people looking at a board, doing work. You can use Jira to manage Scrum. The easiest Scrum, the most canonical Scrum flow is to do, doing, done. Those are your three categories. Those are your swim lines. To do, doing, and done. And boy, if you use physical index cards, if you have a board out there, there is never a question as to what you're exactly working on at the time, what is coming down the pike, and what you have accomplished on a regular basis. This is so natural, so easy, and available in the tools you have at work right now. So why aren't we using it? Bad metaphors. Bad metaphors. What's another metaphor? Oh, building architecture. Building architecture. I don't know if I've ever told you this before. Did you know that I started out in the School of Architecture? I was going to be an architect. I failed out of the School of Architecture. I'll tell you that story in just a moment. But a lot of my talks this year are about architecture. There's a lot of inspiration we can get from architecture. The design patterns that we talk about, that came from Christopher Alexander, an architect who figured out how everyday life is organized, how communities are organized, how small spaces are organized, large spaces are organized. Those are the design patterns he came up with in real life that we adopted in software. As a matter of fact, Christopher Alexander is the reason why I'm not an architect today. My very first year, freshman year at university, I had an entire semester to work on the Capstone Project. It was a space modulator. A space modulator. It was made out of 1-inch cubes of cardboard. It was meant to be 1 foot by 2 feet by 3 feet. It was a very abstract project. It was meant to be outside spaces flowing into inside spaces, large spaces flowing into small spaces, a space modulator. My friend Venkat has a son at university freshman year as well, so he will appreciate this. I had all semester to work on it, so of course I began it the night before it was due. I worked on it furiously all night. I build my space modulator. I'm exhausted. I come up to my room. Here's the exact order of events. I'm holding my space modulator. The phone rings. There is only one free space in the room to put it down. It is the chair. I turn around, pick up the phone, and sit on my space modulator. It ruined my architectural career. I failed out. I talked to my advisor. I said, hey, I sat on my space modulator. And after he got done laughing, he said, tough break. I hope you enjoy your next major, whatever it is. See, architecture is important stuff as well. We can use this as a metaphor for what we do. Martin Fowler, though, says that when people use the term software architect, they're using a metaphor from building construction. Many times a software architect is seen as the chief designer, someone who pulls everything together. But Martin's wife is actually an engineer. And when people say, oh, architects are going to make sure that your website is performant, no. Architects are going to make sure that it is structurally sound. No. That's what engineers do, right? Software architects have the vision for what you're trying to do. Software architects are the one that you sit down with a client and say, what do you want your website to do? I don't know, I want to be able to click on something. What do you want to be able to click on? Oh, maybe a shopping cart. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. So the architect has the vision, sitting down with the client to help you build out your shopping cart-based website, but it's the engineers that make sure it's performant and structurally sound. Martin goes on to say in this article that a better analogy for software architects in software would probably be user interface designers. That's interesting. Is that different from what you would think of as a software architect? See, architecture is about design, not construction. When I see beautiful buildings like this, that is my space modulator after I sat on it. That is what my space modulator looked like. That's why I failed out of school. But architecture is about design. The buildings that you recognize by architects like Frank Lloyd Wright, by I.M. Pei, by Frank Gehry, like this one right here. It's the buildings that are different that you remember. Most of software engineering is really more about construction than anything else. And I know software developers don't like this analogy. They say, wait a second, I liked the analogy before. I don't like where this is going now. Yeah, well, that's the problem with analogies, right? Is we have to take them to their logical conclusion. And if you don't like where your analogy leads you, then perhaps you shouldn't use it anymore. I feel that building architecture is a poor metaphor for software development because it gives an illusion of permanence that simply doesn't match our reality in software development today. Brian Behlendorf, who's one of the original contributors to the Apache Web Server. The Apache Web Server. Many people think that the Apache Web Server was named after the American Indian nation, Native Americans. In fact, it's not. They started with a web server, and there was a bug. So they patched it, and then someone else patched it, and someone else patched it, and what were they left with? They were left with a Apache Web Server. Metaphors can be funny, too. But Brian Behlendorf knows about long-term software. The Apache Web Server has been around since 1995. It's still one of the most, if not the most popular, most used web server on the web. We can have software that's measured in decades, not years or months. But we have to do that intentionally. In this book, The World is Flat. By the way, this is an outstanding read. Much of it happens here in Bengaluru. It's worth checking out. Thomas Friedman is a columnist for the New York Times, but he talks about technology in the 21st century and how it's changed things. And Brian Behlendorf in this book says most software is not gold. Managers think that they're building gold, that we're building value. The more time and effort we put on this, we are adding to our portfolio. Brian says, in fact, most software these days is lettuce, not gold, lettuce. So, what can we use from building architecture as a metaphor that better describes what we do? I would argue that form follows function is something we should consider. Form follows function. Have you heard this before? If you're an architecture student, you can't go through your career without hearing this over and over and over again. Form follows function came out of an architect around the turn of the 20th century, Louis Sullivan. He is the father of modern skyscrapers. Before Louis Sullivan, skyscrapers were ornate. They had intricately carved figures. They had artistry and cornices and all kinds of things. And he said, while that's beautiful, and let's not discount beauty, the form of the building, the beautifulness of that building, should be secondary to the functionality of that building. So this is the first modern skyscraper, and it's notable because this is a new epoch in architecture. This is a new way of building out buildings that are functional first, and the form that follows is secondary in purpose. Now, I mentioned Frank Lloyd Wright. He was one of my personal heroes. He was a student of Louis Sullivan's, and one of his most famous houses, Falling Water, has all of those spare lines. There's no ornamentation here. But can you see how Falling Waters comes out over the waterfall? It comes out of the cliffs. It echoes its surroundings. This is beautiful without a bit of ornamentation on it. This is what I think of every time I think of form follows function. There can be beauty in something that is boiled down to its essence without unnecessary ornamentation. We call that gilding the lily, right? The lily is beautiful enough. So what does form follows function look like in our industry? TDD, test-driven development. What you do is you start with a unit test. You do with the simplest, most minimal thing you can do. This is what I want this code to do, and then you write the code to pass the test. And then you do it again. Write a test. Write the code that does the minimum possible thing to fulfill it, and move on to the next. Sounds like Kanban, doesn't it? But this cadence is just as important. But if you start with functionality instead of form, what you don't have are megabytes of JavaScript being downloaded with your website in the form of frameworks. What you don't have are CSS frameworks that measure in the megabytes that style what you might use someday, maybe, rather than focusing on the features that you're writing and styling them individually. It's a whole different way of approaching this software. And TDD is most certainly the best embodiment of form follows function we have in our industry. So, we've examined a couple of bad metaphors and hopefully given you ways to replace them with healthy, positive metaphors. Do you notice there's a metaphor I haven't mentioned yet? It was in the title of the talk. The Ship of Theseus. The Ship of Theseus is the metaphor I want to leave you with today. Theseus, in fact, was the first king of Athens. Again, we're back in ancient Greek times. The first king of Athens. That defined the new epoch. That defined the new era. Much like King Bluetooth, Theseus united a number of city-states. It brought them together. King Theseus unified the religion as well. King Theseus brought these disparate city-states together as a nation for the first time. And so to celebrate their hero, their George Washington, their Mahatma Gandhi, they saved a ship that he took into battle. He saved this most famous ship of Theseus. And what they did was they parked it in the harbor. And they used it every year as a part of religious ceremonies. This was intrinsic to the health and the lifeblood of the city of Athens. They maintained this ship for quite literally hundreds of years. This ship was around for centuries. And so folks like Plato and Aristotle, those pesky philosophers, scientists that we talked about earlier, they started asking uncomfortable questions. They said, is this really the ship of Theseus? And everyone said, of course it is. This is the ship that he took into battle. They said, but is it really? See, a ship made of wood is not going to last for hundreds of years. So what happens is that ship, every time it goes into battle, when it comes back, you repair it. You take out the old, rotten wood and repair it with new, stronger wood. This is what had happened over the centuries. By the time it got to Plato's time, several hundred years later, he says, I don't think that's the Ship of Theseus at all. I don't think there's an original piece of wood on this boat. Isn't that the kind of argument that philosophers like to make? But it's interesting, isn't it? This feels like software development to me. This feels like websites to me. If you go out to my website, thirstyhead.com, it has gone through a variety of different frameworks, a variety of different languages. Let's see, it started out in ASP, not ASP.NET, young bloods. I'm talking ASP back in the day. And then I moved to JSP and struts and JSTL. I didn't move to Spring because at that time I was into Grails, and so I lived through several versions of Grails. Grails O.O.O. until it got to 1.0, and then Grails 2.0 and beyond. In more recent times, I wrote it in Prototype and Scriptaculous. I wrote it in Backbone.js. I wrote it in Angular.js. And you know what's interesting? What do I have to show for all of that effort? Have I preserved any of that content throughout the years? This website's been around for over a decade. Have I preserved any of that? Do I have any evidence of the hard work I've put into thirstyhead.com? No. Because every time I moved to a new framework, I burned the boats. I started over from scratch. And so even though thirstyhead.com has been around for decades, I have no evidence, no longevity associated with that. So last year, I said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write thirstyhead.com in HTML, in vanilla HTML, in JavaScript, and in CSS. And you know what happened? I got really uncomfortable. Because all of a sudden I realized that all my effort had been in learning the latest new framework. I got so excited. That's why I had my own website. I could use it as a learning tool, as a laboratory out in the real world. I could prove to people that, of course, I knew Grails. Look at my website right here. But what about the content? What about the purpose of that website? When I stripped away all the frameworks and all the languages, I was forced to focus on what did I want thirstyhead.com to say. I was forced to focus on the content and the message and the meaning. And I got uncomfortable. Only because it was the first time in 10 years I was having the conversation that I probably should have had when I started the website in the first place. So I had my very own Ship of Theseus crisis right there. Let me leave you one more aspect of this metaphor. Medical professionals, scientists say that every cell in the human body gets replaced every 7 years. Each one of us is our very own Ship of Theseus, aren't we? Are you the same person after 7 years? After 14 years? After 21 years? Of course, that's why it's a paradox, right? You can answer, yes, of course I am, and no, I'm a very different person. I like saying I'm literally twice the man I used to be, right? I don't know if that's an improvement or not. That's an observation. So, what we're left with here then is a really powerful metaphor, a really interesting metaphor, because ships, unlike stone buildings like the Colosseum, unlike pyramids, don't have that same sense of permanence. See, ships are made with fungible materials, things that decay over time, like wood and hemp and cloth. If you want to maintain a ship's seaworthiness, you have to attend to your ship every day. You have to be out there polishing the wood. You have to be out there scraping barnacles off. You have to be out there constantly looking for what's rotting and replacing it. I feel that that is such a rich metaphor for what we do as professionals. Metaphors can be fun as well. Software is done in the same way that dishes are done, right? I've heard this phrased in a bunch of different ways. Software is done like brushing your teeth is done. Software is done like gardening is done. The idea here is you can stop brushing your teeth once you stop caring about your teeth. That problem will solve itself, won't it? If you stop brushing your teeth will eventually fall out, and there you go, problem solved. None of that pesky time brushing your teeth every morning. None of that pesky time maintaining your software. Your software is done when you stop caring about it. And this is why I feel the building metaphor is so unfortunate, because we have this expectation that finally I've erected the building, I've cut the ribbon, and now, we're done. That's not the case. It's the case with buildings, but not the case with what we do. Frameworks. I'm in dangerous territory right now, aren't I? This is maybe while you're here. Dillip is like, enough talk about the frameworks, right? I love frameworks. I've spent my career discussing frameworks. I've written books. I've given training classes about this. Frameworks can be a great inspiration, so I'm not hating on frameworks. However, there's always a however, isn't there? If we spend our time focusing solely on frameworks, it is a never-ending battle. Frameworks are coming out every day. And if you spend your time focusing on keeping up with all of the new frameworks, much like me maintaining thirstyhead.com, you will lose sight of what your true intent is. If you feel that your job as a programmer is to keep up with new frameworks, you're probably missing the most important part of your job, which is writing software. Frameworks, like a programming language, are an ultimately boring, inconsequential implementation detail. If you focus on the website, the syntax and the framework, much like the Ship of Theseus, can be swapped out over time as one framework gets old and moldy and you want to move on to the next. You certainly can, but you need to design for that. Neil Ford, who's here this week, says architecture is identifying the things that are hard to change over time. Architecture is identifying the things that are hard to change over time. What changes frequently? Fashion. Fashion. There was a movement in the 1700s called dandyism. And I love this. Beau Brummel was one of the most popular ones. He said greatness was based on nothing at all. But he was never seen unpowdered or unperfumed, immaculately bathed and shaved, dressed in the finest of clothes. But he was an empty vessel. He was famous for nothing other than fashion. Continuing with our Ship of Theseus metaphor right now, we know that it is hardest to sail in shallow waters. You're buffeted by waves. You're constantly in vigilance in the shallow waters. But when you get to deep waters, the currents move more slowly. Things are calm, and you can focus on what's important instead of just surviving. We should strive for that deeper water. We should focus on standards, not frameworks. We need to recognize frameworks as fashion. And I don't mean that there's nothing we can learn from frameworks. In fact, we can continue to be inspired by frameworks. But frameworks are measured in months, in years. Standards are around much longer than that. This is the very first web page. It is available on the internet today. Go to your search engine and type in the very first web page, and you'll get a link to this. This is what Tim Berners-Lee wrote in 1989, and it's still available today. Because it's not based on frameworks. It's based on standards. HTML. HTTP. It's notable that the first web page is around almost 30 years later. 30 years later. The transport that we used to get it here, HTTP, has been unchanged for 20 years. See, HTTP 1.0 came out with GET and POST. It took a modification, HTTP 1.1, to give us PUT and delete. But once that happened, once we have GET, PUT, POST, delete, and of course the other fun ones as hell, head and trace and options, and all those verbs, what we recognize now is if we build our software based on this, GET, PUT, POST, and delete, our software can be measured in decades, not years, not months. I have clients that have been up and running for over a decade because we turned around and we built it based on standards on RESTful interfaces. I also have made quite a good living converting SOAP-based websites to REST. How many of you still use SOAP these days? Yeah, exactly. How many of you use REST? Of course. Let me ask you a question. How many of you use GraphQL right now? It's interesting. There are interesting things we can learn. Is it a standard or is it a framework? How many people implement, how many different organizations have an implementation of GraphQL? How many different software organizations have an implementation of HTTP? Those are the questions we need to be asking ourselves as we're building out our own personal Ship of Theseus. We need to take a long view, not a short-term, fashionable view. Because what we find are the things that survive over time aren't ornate. They're simple. They're boiled down to their essence. They are the embodiment of form follows function. Steve Jobs says simple can be incredibly harder than complex. You have to work hard to get your thinking clean to make it simple. But it's worth it. Because once you get there, you can move mountains. If we think about what embodies the iPhone, it is one button, not 101 keys and a mouse. If we think about the experience of iPods, those earbuds, those Bluetooth earbuds, it's amazing. I had a number of different Bluetooth headphones, and each time I had to turn it on and turn it off and reboot it and charge it and do these things. When I bought the earbuds, I went to the store, I pulled it out of the packaging, I opened them up, it immediately paired with my phone. I put them in my ear and they started working. That is what we need to be striving towards, that simplicity, that elegance. Now, Rich Hickey, the founder of the Clojure language, has even more to say about simplicity. He says that indeed, simplicity is hard work, but there is a huge payoff. The person who has a genuinely simpler system, a system made out of genuinely simple parts, is going to be able to affect the greatest change with the least amount of work. She is going to spend more time simplifying things up front, and in the long haul, she is going to wipe up the plate with you, because she will have the ability to change things while you're struggling to push elephants around. Struggling to push elephants around, we have a metaphor for that as well, don't we? King Sisyphus was in another era as well, another epic, but he was punished for his self-aggrandizing craftiness by being forced to push the same boulder up the same hill, and when he got to the top, it would roll back down and have to do it all over again for all of eternity. Does that feel like keeping up with frameworks to you? Every time you change frameworks, this is essentially what you have to do. You have to burn the boats. What is your upgrade path from Angular to React? What is your upgrade path from React to Vue? What is your upgrade path from Vue to whatever is going to come out next week? Where is that sense of longevity? Where is that sense of pride? Where is that sense of this boat is going to be around for centuries, not months, not weeks? We see this happening in our industry. Now, this is very early days, but we're seeing this kind of conversation begin to happen. Netflix, one of the largest websites in North America. Netflix represents 75% of North American traffic on any given evening. They're a React app. And on their homepage, when they pulled React off of their homepage, the internet lost its mind. They said, "Did you rip out React from your entire website?" They said, no. We just measured performance, and we found on that homepage, we didn't need it. We didn't need it. And so we stripped it out, and we immediately got a 50% performance boost. Form follows function. They use React where it adds value, and they don't use React where it doesn't add value. Dan Abramoff, who's one of the core contributors to React, says there is no possible way that React can be faster than vanilla JavaScript. There is no possible way that a framework can be faster than the technology it is built upon. But what is React? It's an abstraction. It's a metaphor. And he goes on to say, for us, it's fast enough. For us, the value in this isn't raw speed. It allows us to think about web development in a functional way. It allows us to change DOM manipulation in a more reproducible way. And in fact, React, one of the key benefits of React, is it allows you to use React Native. So you can build out native mobile applications. It allows you to do server-side rendering. The value of React and its virtual DOM is, in fact, the virtual DOM. If you need that functionality, if you need a way to write your app once and compile it to mobile phones and desktop browsers and smart TVs and do server-side rendering and all kinds of things, then React, in fact, is a perfect solution. How many of you are doing that right now? Form follows function indeed, doesn't it? Now this is where people get spitting mad. He says, you might not even use Redux. And they say, wait a second. I was told I needed that. In this very thoughtful article, he says, do the work and then decide if you need Redux. Do the work and then decide if this adds value. That's not controversial. That's coming from the founder of the framework himself. So, where does this leave us? ThoughtWorks puts out a technology radar several times a year, and one thing that's come up that I find particularly compelling is this notion of micro front ends. When we're talking about abstractions, when we're talking about things to think about, I don't think anyone is going to argue about the value of microservices. Microservices can add complexity, but it should, done right, add simplicity. Rather than having this monolith on the back end, you should have narrowly focused services, services that are highly cohesive, that are loosely coupled, that do one thing and one thing only, services that allow you to deploy themselves independently of all those other services. If you're moving to a microservices framework, you're buying that Ship of Theseus mentality, that you can swap out individual services without having to burn the entire boat. But what is state of the art on the front end? A monolith. So just like we broke down the monolith of the back end, micro front ends are a call to action for us to break down the monolith on the front ends as well. This is something that I'm doing actively in all the work I'm doing. In all the work I do in every one of my clients now, I say, I think we should prototype in vanilla HTML. How many of you prototype at all outside of the framework in production? Oh, the hands go down again. Okay, yeah. We should prototype in vanilla HTML. We should performance test in vanilla HTML. Because how can you measure the cost of your framework? Not the benefit of your framework, but the cost of your framework. If you baseline in vanilla HTML and then you add your framework on top of that, you have a very clear delta and you decide, is this cost worth it? The average modern web page these days takes 22 seconds to load on a mobile device on a 3G network. 22 seconds. When does the average user leave? After 2 seconds. So much of what we have focused on is the developer experience. Look how easy it is to create a hello world. Look how easy it is to bring in all these dependencies. Look at all the tooling I'm giving you to hide the complexity from you. But if you have websites that are loading in 22 seconds and users that will wait 2, we have some challenges, and we need to address those challenges. This is one way to do it. So, where does this leave us? I hope you're not depressed about what's coming up. I hope you're excited about what's coming up. I am so excited about this industry. I'm so excited about what I do on a daily basis. Metaphors are truly important. They help us understand what we're doing. Whether it's punch cards that get carried down the hall, or Ethernet that combines all of these celestial bodies together. Whether it's bugs in our software or Bluetooth. We find that these metaphors are so powerful because they're so evocative. They help us understand and explain what we do. Metaphors can be bad as well. No one would set out and design a system like this, so metaphors help us recognize the shortcomings of our initial thoughts. What looked good on paper in practice maybe doesn't play out as effectively as we had hoped it would. We need to be very cognizant of what we're writing. Are we focused on fashion? Are we focused on fundamentals? Form follows function, and you need to be able to recognize the difference between fashion and standards. And if you find yourself doing this, if this is part of your business plan, if your business plan is planned obsolescence after 2 or 3 years, you in fact are not building gold at all. It's incredibly expensive building ships. We need to focus on the longevity so we truly can get the benefit, the ROI on what we've invested in that. What we really should be doing is building our own personal Ship of Theseus. Thank you very much for your time and attention.